All right. We're going to go ahead and get started, and we're going to jump into the traditions, and we're going to talk a little bit about the service structure of AA. Did you just get excited about the traditions? That's what I'm talking about. That's awesome. Traditions are something that the group that I attended made it mandatory to study the traditions inside the meeting, and before every single meeting they took one tradition, somebody read it, explained it, and so it became a part of my consistent recovery, whereas before I didn't know what they were, and I was, to be honest with you, trying to avoid them a little bit because it just seemed like extra stuff. It's just extra that I didn't really need. And what I failed to realize initially was that just like the steps address the health of the individual, the traditions address the health of the group. And it's absolutely vital for us to grow as a fellowship adhering to the traditions. And so it was important to look at this and study it. And I went through the back of my book and studied the long form with my group, studied the short form, picked up a 12 and 12, and studied the traditions out of that as well. And at this group, one of the things that we did was called a group inventory. And we did this, I want to say every year, if not every other year. And we would sit down and look at the traditions and pose the questions to ourselves. How am I adhering to the traditions or breaking the traditions on a personal level? And how does that affect my group? And then it became very personal. And then it became my responsibility. Whereas before I could say, that's the group's responsibility. Well, who's a member of the group? Me. And so I had to take that with some seriousness. And the traditions were somewhat born out of a lot of the mistakes that we made early on and some of the things that we did that maybe we shouldn't have. But gosh, isn't that how everything great is formed? We stumble a little bit. We have the humility to learn from those mistakes. And thank God they put them in writing. Can you imagine if the traditions had been passed down generation to generation, what they would look like today? They would probably say, do anything you want. It makes no difference. But there's some clear and precise instructions on this. So we're going to flip to the back of the book, the appendices that talk about the traditions, and go through these and take a good look at them. And we're going to talk a little bit about the service structure, like I mentioned, as we do that. One of the things that we do in my group is that we looked at that very first page, which I never like to read any sort of preface or prelude to anything. I always just want to skip right into it. And there's a lot of good information here in the back of the book. So if you want to jump back there with me, it says, the AA tradition. To those now in its fold, Alcoholics Anonymous has made the difference between misery and sobriety, and often the difference between life and death. There is no truer statement that's ever been made. AA can, of course, reach just as much to uncounted alcoholics not yet reached. So whose responsibility is it for us to keep this fellowship and program intact for the people who are going to need it 50 years down the road? They're depending on us to keep this stuff intact, right? Therefore, no society of men and women ever had a more urgent need for continuous effectiveness and permanent sobriety. I took that statement and wrote it in the front of my book because I need to remember that I'm a part of something. Right? My time in sobriety hasn't yielded me a better place. It hasn't given me a higher ranking. It doesn't afford me more opinions. It actually does the opposite, right? And so the traditions are designed to get me to see that I'm going to have to yield to the greater good of the group. And that's hard for a lot of us, because who in here has opinions? I better see every one of your hands. You shake your head now. You raise your hand up. We all have opinions, but here's the deal. The greater good of the group comes before my personal opinion. And that's an ego deflation that's very real and very necessary. It says, we alcoholics see that we must work together and hang together, else most of us will finally die alone. Bill said that unity was our greatest asset, and the first tradition begins to address that in a very real manner. It says the 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous are we AAs believe the best answer that our experience has yet given to those ever-urgent questions. How can AA best function? And how can AA best stay whole and survive? And what you're going to see when you look back through history is that AA was sort of mushrooming and it was growing at an exponential rate, and we're not seeing a lot of that today. And I can guarantee you that a lot of that has to do with our groups not adhering to the traditions. We want what we want, when we want it, and we want all you people to get on board with it. And it becomes about who's the loudest, who has the most time, who's the most controlling, runs the group. There's no person that should run the group. This is our group. Makes sense? When I came into AA, I was looking for like the president of AA. Like, who's in charge of this deal? I need to get to somebody at the top. And what I quickly found out was there's no one at the top. This is a society that functions best when we yield to one another. And there's a spirit of rotation that they're going to talk about as well. It says on the next page, AA's 12 traditions are seen in their so-called short forms. We've got 2 forms to look at. The form in general use today. This is a condensed version of the original long-form AA tradition, first printed in 1946. Because the long form is more explicit and of possible historic value, it's also reproduced. In my group that I got sober in, they read the long form and they read the short form as well, and it's important to note everything that's in there. And interestingly enough, the second tradition, short form, is longer than the long form. So in true AA style, we're going to confuse the hell out of you until you get it, right? I'm just checking you to make sure you're paying attention. It's just real funny to me. Anyway, and much like the steps, there's quite a few of us that want to adhere to certain traditions, and then other traditions we want to lay to the side, or we want to have a little variation of them. And I'd encourage you to take a look at what your motive is, right? And want to do that kind of stuff. Because I know when I want to do that with the steps, it's because I'm being lazy, or because I'm being defiant, or I don't want to adhere to what you want to do because I value my opinion more than I value yours. And that's a mistake when we're looking at this from a group level. So we're going to start on the long form. It says, our AA experience has taught us that. That's important to note. Our experience has taught us that. The first tradition says, each member of Alcoholics Anonymous is but a small part of a great whole. AA must continue to live, or most of us will surely die. Hence, our common welfare comes first, but individual welfare follows close afterward. Right? So the unity of the group comes way before me. Right? The individual is very secondary to the group as a whole. One of the problems that we see oftentimes in our groups is in our fellowships is that we want to congregate in much smaller groups. In the United States, they call them cliques. I don't know what they would call them here. Maybe the same verbiage. But we want to segregate into small groups, and we feel this way, and we think a certain way, and we're going to battle each other. Y'all seen that in the groups? What's kind of interesting and kind of annoying is when we're in a meeting and we start sharing at each other. Right? Have you seen that? You're going to share something and I've got to retort. So I'm going to share back at you. You know, and what are we doing? We're causing divisiveness. One of the things I learned from a very wise man is that divisiveness kills an AA group. And more importantly, it kills the individual who comes to sit in our meeting, is looking for a solution, but we're so busy battling one another that we fail to see this man is detoxing. He needs a sponsor. He needs a solution. But I'm too busy trying to prove that Thomas is wrong, and I'm over here gossiping with Peter about it, that I fail to see that this man needs some help. Right? It's our responsibility to set that stuff to rest. And it's your responsibility as a sponsor, right? Because it's going to happen. There are going to be problems in the group. I remember coming to my sponsor. This is embarrassing now, kind of. But I remember coming to my sponsor at one point and I said, I always sit in this seat. This is my seat. I always sit here. Why is he sitting in my seat? And it was a very real resentment. It was a very serious 10-step in that moment. He's in my seat. And she said, you don't have a seat here. You are a member of the group. That is not your seat. I mean, if you want to sit there, get early. Come early and sit in your own little seat. But she basically made fun of me, which I deserved. Right? But it's causing divisiveness within the group. The women seem to have a knack for it. Right? We want to sit, he says, you've seen it. We know how we can be. Right? We want to gossip, and a friend of mine uses the analogy that we're like crabs in a bucket. And as soon as a bunch of them start to get healthy and well and things are going well, the rest of us want to pull them down as they're trying to climb out of the bucket. What are we doing? Have we forgotten where we are? We are an Alcoholics Anonymous. This is not cheerleading camp, right? Where I'm going to be jealous of you and hateful about you and talk about you, and she's dating that guy and I have a crush on that guy. What are you doing? If you're a sponsor, shut that down. Stop that right there. Because I got to tell you, the little girl that gets her feelings hurt leaves the meeting and doesn't come back because you want to be jealous about something. And we've all been guilty of it, the gossip and the criticism. I had to write a note in my book because at one point in my group, it caused such a riot that the women in the group divided down one line. You're sponsored by this woman, and this is all her lineage. You're sponsored by this other lady, and this is all her lineage. And we were at battle with each other. What the hell is that about? What are we doing? We should be focusing our time and attention on carrying the message and taking these women through the work, not gossiping and criticizing each other. And I watched the fall of a group happen around that stuff. It was really, really unfortunate. But this gentleman told me this statement I wrote in my book. It says, gossip and criticism will absolutely kill an AA group. Practice the principles and keep it out of the group. That gossip and criticism is meant for your sponsor in a 10-step format. So they can tell you how wrong you are, like they always do. Right? Shut it down so you can be happy and move it on down the road. But that unity, guys, we'll die without it. We absolutely will. And we're carrying the message together. I spend more time with alcoholics, than a lot of people in my world. We're going to have to learn to live together and love one another. I don't like everybody, and they most certainly don't like me half the time, but we have to love each other and work in unity. It's very, very necessary. All right, we'll skip on to the second tradition. It says, for our group purpose, there is one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. I'm going to read the short form because it's actually longer. It says, for our group purpose, there is one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. Here's the kicker. Our leaders are but trusted servants. They do not govern. Did anybody think that the people sitting on the steering committee were above them? Or the intergroup reps were above them? I did. I remember when they elected me to be the intergroup rep, I was like, here I go. I am the intergroup rep. I did. I went, this is embarrassing. This is like share about me time. Selfish. I went home and told my mother, I said, they elected me to be the intergroup rep. I am going to be, she said, what is that? I said, I don't know. I don't know, but I'm going to do it. And I just, thought I had a big S on my chest for Superwoman. I mean, little did I know what I had gotten myself into. The leaders are trusted servants, they do not govern. So when I take a service position, and there was a question about this earlier, and I think it's a fantastic, she wrote it down, I think it's a fantastic question. She said, what's the difference between carrying the message and being of service? It's a wonderful question. But when I take a service position, I have to understand that the service structure is like an inverted triangle. I didn't know that. I thought you sort of moved your way up. I'm an intergroup rep, so now I'm above the group. Now I'm at a district level, I'm above this. Now I'm at an area level, I'm above the district. It's not. The more service that I accept, the lower down the totem pole I go. My main job is to serve the group. So whatever the group decides that their vote is going to be, or that their stance is going to be, as an intergroup rep, I take that information to the district level and present it. It has nothing to do with me. I work for you. I didn't know it was a step down. I was a grunt at that point. And rightfully so, I needed it. Right? You should have seen me. Here I go. That was awesome. But where does the service committee, or where does the steering committee get their direction? Well, it all goes back to the health of a group. If I've got a steering committee full of a bunch of sober, recovered people that are tapped into the power of God, then it reads just like it does in the tradition. It says that the ultimate authority is a loving God as he may express himself in the group conscience. Right? So when we call a group conscience committee, we're going to vote on, how many birthday meetings do we want to have? Or do we want to take this, we've got 3 big book meetings. Do we want to keep 2 of these big book meetings and make 1 a step speaker meeting? That's fine, but we're going to take it to the group conscience. Because me and her are on the steering committee, we don't decide that without you. It doesn't police the group, right? It's a place for us to take our concerns. It's a place for us to take our ideas, which are sometimes entertaining ideas. If you haven't had the opportunity to sit on a steering committee, get on that. Get on that. It's interesting. But we're going to be here to serve the group. We are. So I have to take my ideas and set them to the side because I'm here to serve the group, and I've got to have that ego deflation. And if I've been through the work, it's already begun. But sometimes the sponsor has to remind us, your opinion, this is not the format for it. If the group decides that they want to change the format of the meeting, they want to have one speaker meeting and 2 big book meetings, then that's what we're doing. And as the steering committee, you rewrite the format and call it a day. It doesn't matter whether you agree with it or not. And I was like, well, this has afforded me really no additional power, to be on the steering committee. I mean, you would think the steering committee would steer things in a certain direction. No, they don't. They serve the group. It's important to note that. But it's got to be driven. It's got to really be driven by the power of God, which means that when we take something to the steering committee and they have meetings, they're going to discuss them and then they're going to table it. They're going to take it to prayer and meditation, and then they're going to meet again. And if we can't all agree on it in that meeting, we're going to table it again. Take it back into prayer and meditation, because nobody needs to be right. Right, have you seen those fallouts from the steering committee? Have you ever been in a group like that, where they're just at war? You ever seen a group conscience meeting blow up? Ooh, something else, right? And it'll tell you real quick the health of your group when we can't come together and meet and discuss ideas and options in a cordial fashion. I've got friends of mine that talk about being in a group conscience meeting where, things were thrown, people were yelling over what color we're going to paint the walls. Are you kidding me? Who cares? Right? But we're so concerned about having it our way. Something to think about. All right, third tradition. It says our membership ought to include all who suffer from alcoholism. Hence, we may refuse none who wish to recover. Nor ought AA membership ever depend upon money or conformity. Any 2 or 3 alcoholics gathered together for sobriety may call themselves an AA group, provided that, as a group, they have no other affiliation. Right? So there's a singleness of purpose attached to this tradition, and it talks about membership. And there's sometimes confusion about, if I'm not a member, can I attend the meeting? Yes. Right? Can I talk in the meeting if I'm not an alcoholic? It depends on the format of the meeting. When you sit in a meeting and they say this is a closed meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, if you are in fact not an alcoholic, we don't need to share in that meeting. Right? It's a closed meeting. If you're in an open meeting, you absolutely are welcome to be in there. I've brought family members to our open meetings who were not alcoholic. Some of them that were alcoholic that needed to be in recovery but wouldn't get on board with my plan. I tried to lure them in. I like to subtly do things like that. Right? But if it's an open meeting, you're welcome to be in there. Al-Anon people come all the time. It's not a big deal. But to claim membership in Alcoholics Anonymous, you need to be an alcoholic. Right? Now, the book is very clear on, if you say you're a member, you're a member. Have at it. Why do you want to be? That's my question. If you're an overeater sitting in AA, are you welcome to be there? Sure. Sit with us. Cool. I'm not going to your meetings, though. Why would I want to? There's an identification process that's very real. You watch 2 drug addicts sit down and sync up immediately. 2 gambling addicts sit down and talk and identify, and they're on the same page. If you're not an alcoholic, why do you want to be here? That might be the bigger question. Instead of fighting it, why don't we find the fellowship that better suits you? Because here's another question. Where are you most effective? I understand the 12 steps, and I can teach them with some consistency. But to lead a gambler through the 12 steps, it may not be where I'm most effective. I can walk away from the blackjack table when I need to, after I've lost a bunch of money, usually. But I can do that. I have the power to do it. So for me to sit down and attempt to identify with you may not be in your best interest. So instead of demanding that I can do what I want to do, I know this is making some of you uncomfortable, instead of demanding for me to be able to do what I want, maybe you think about the other person. Where are you most effective? Right? Again, if you want to sit in the meetings, absolutely. Absolutely. But be mindful and be respectful of the type of meeting you're sitting in and what you see. We call them a preamble. I don't know, is that what you call them? Okay, so when they read that in the beginning of the meeting, they'll tell you this is an open meeting of AA. This is a closed meeting of CA. They'll say whatever it is. Be respectful of that. You're in their house. Make sense? Cool. All right, tradition 4. It said, with respect to its own affairs, each AA group should be responsible to no other authority than its own conscience. this is cool. This is the tradition that sets up autonomy, that allows our groups to have their own personality. It says, but when its plans concern the welfare of neighboring groups also, those groups ought to be consulted. And no group, regional committee, or individual should ever take any action which might greatly affect AA as a whole without conferring with the trustees of the General Service Board. On such issues, our common welfare is paramount. Right? So I can set the group up. We can set the group up any way we'd like to, but it cannot affect AA as a whole. Right? So if we sit down and say, hey, me and Margareta want to start a new group, we're going to need to register that group with the General Service Office. We can say, we want to do a big book study. It's fine for us to do that. We can say, we're going to do a discussion meeting. It's fine for us to do that if we want to. We're going to have 6 meetings a week. We're going to have one. It doesn't matter. Right? You can run the meeting however you'd like to. You want to give out chips at the beginning? Cool. You want to do it at the end? Have at it. This tradition affords you the right to do whatever you'd like to do, but it's got to stay within AA. If we start doing a bunch of goofy stuff in our meetings, does that affect AA as a whole? Yeah, because the newcomer who sits down in there assumes, because there's a circle and triangle out there, that they're sitting in AA. But what are you doing? You're studying some random book that's not a piece of conference-approved literature and wanting to call it AA. No, that's not what we're doing. Makes sense? There's a lot of misunderstanding about this stuff. Well, it says any 2 or 3 can gather and call it an AA group. You can, if it doesn't affect AA as a whole. And if you've got questions about what you want to do, run it by your sponsor. Run it by members of other groups. Right? It's important to know how this stuff can affect stuff. Tradition 5, it says each Alcoholics Anonymous group ought to be a spiritual entity, having but one primary purpose, that of carrying its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. There's a lot said in that. So each group needs to be a spiritual entity. How do we do that? Do we just show up and meet together all the time? No, we better be doing the work. We better be doing the steps. How can we maintain health as a group collectively when most of us are not doing the steps? We're just sitting in the meetings. Right? Something to think about. You'll see the quality of sobriety on the rise in your group as you take a whole bunch of newcomers through and they start participating. Right? And then they start sponsoring people and the group begins to grow. And it's growing. Just like we grow in understanding and effectiveness, the group will grow in understanding and effectiveness. But we've got to teach them how to apply spiritual principles in every area of their life too, so they can apply it within the group. It's also going to say that we have one primary purpose. One. Which means that better be the focus of the group. I learned real quick and in a hurry when I joined AA that if I didn't want to carry the message and I didn't want to sponsor people, I wasn't going to make it at this group because they didn't tolerate any nonsense. They didn't tolerate me discussing my ideas and opinions in the meetings. You could comment, I know they're hardcore, you could comment on the text being read, but if you had even attempted to share your opinion, they shut you down. It was real embarrassing. It never happened to me because I was too scared to do it. And I didn't know anything anyway, and I knew it. I knew better than to do all that. I didn't want to get a note from Cliff. But it gets real clear about what that one primary purpose is. If you're joining a new group or you're starting a new group, go in and ask them, where are you guys carrying the message? Where are you guys being of service? How can I be helpful? Because a healthy group is going to say, we're so glad you're here, we need you. On Wednesday nights, we go down to the such and such shelter. On Friday mornings, we go over to this detox. So that's a healthy group that's out on the firing line, so they're not hiding in the meetings. Right? So go and ask those questions. It's your right to do that. But notice it says carrying its message. I don't carry my group's message. I carry the message of Alcoholics Anonymous, which means I better have read this book and I better have done these steps. Because otherwise, what am I carrying? I'm carrying my ideas and opinions and whatever else I'd like to talk about at any given point. But this is a God-centered and a God-focused program. And I know that rubs some people the wrong way, but I got to tell you, the book is crystal clear. The program of Alcoholics Anonymous is unapologetically about God. Over and over and over. And it's okay if that rubs you the wrong way. I used to hear a guy say, well, if God drives you out, whiskey will drive you back. And I was like, okay, I can get with that. That makes sense to me. If the spiritual part of this program makes you uncomfortable, might be time to have a new experience. Anybody heard of the set-aside prayer? You heard of that? Okay, I knew you had, Peter. Right? And it talks about setting aside everything I think I know about the program, about the steps, the fellowship, my experience in AA, and having a brand new experience, right? So if I'm disagreeing with some of these traditions, or I don't quite like the words that are in this book, maybe I don't know as much as I thought I did. Because I can tell you that these traditions were born out of pure necessity to be vital. All right, tradition 6. Problems of money, property, and authority may easily divert us from our primary spiritual aim. We think, therefore, that any considerable property of genuine use to AA should be separately incorporated and managed, thus dividing the material from the spiritual. An AA group as such should never go into business. That's funny to me. Secondary, because they all wanted to. Secondary aids to AA, such as clubs or hospitals which require much property or administration, ought to be incorporated and so set apart that, if necessary, they can be freely discarded by the groups. Hence, such facilities ought not to use the AA name. Their management should be the sole responsibility of those people who financially support them. For clubs, AA managers are usually preferred. But hospitals, as well as other places of recuperation, ought to be well outside AA and medically supervised. While an AA group may cooperate with anyone, such cooperation ought never go so far as affiliation or endorsement, actual or implied. An AA group can bind itself to no one. So this is directions on what to do and what not to do. And if you know anything about the history, you know that initially some of the AA members thought that they were going to start their own little detox centers and affiliated with their home groups. Right? I mean, I love people that have ambition. I really do. And they were going to turn this into a business. And if you want to be in the recovery business, you are so welcome to do that outside of AA. Those two cannot be affiliated. An easy way to think about that is not to get involved with anything that's not AA and distracts us from our primary purpose. That's really going to be our issue. There's a lot of places in the Dallas area that we like to carry the message to and like to be friends with. There are treatment centers, jails, detoxes, medical communities, things like that. On an individual level, I take a meeting in there. My group is not affiliated with them. Makes sense? So there's no AA opinion on what treatment center you should go to and what treatment center you should not go to. AA doesn't have opinions on things like that. I personally have an opinion on it, but it's not to be talked about inside the confines of a meeting. Does that make sense? I remember reading that for the first time and thinking, well, I have a lot of opinions on that, right? And they said, that's fine. You can have an opinion. You cannot state that that's your group's opinion. You can't state that that's Alcoholics Anonymous opinion. You just can't. There's a lot of places that the group that I got sober in meets in a church. They meet kind of like a room like this, like a gymnasium or an auditorium that's part of a church. We are not affiliated with that church. It has nothing to do with that, right? Because I can't combine anything outside with what we do inside AA meetings. Right? Because all of a sudden, if I'm affiliated with the church has opinions about what we need to do in the meeting. We have opinions about what the pastor needs to be doing in his services. No, those are two separate entities, and I've got to be real clear not to get that confused. And it says actual or implied. And you hear a lot of people a lot of times talking about things that, well, the AA's opinion on that is, or, AA doesn't have an opinion on it. Get crystal clear on it. All right, 7 tradition. It says the AA groups themselves ought to be fully supported by the voluntary contributions of their own members. Look at there. We're going to grow up and take some responsibility financially for ourselves. I've never once gotten a letter in the mail from AA asking for a contribution. Never once. Because we are fully self-supporting based on our own contributions. We think that each group should soon... Is anybody else afraid of birds? I hear them outside and it freaks me out. We think that each group should soon achieve this ideal, that any public solicitation of funds using the name of Alcoholics Anonymous is highly dangerous, whether by groups, clubs, hospitals, or other outside agencies, that acceptance of large gifts from any source or of contributions carrying any obligation whatever is unwise. Then, too, we will view with much concern those AA treasuries which continue beyond prudent reserve to accumulate funds for no stated AA purpose. Experience has warned us that nothing will so surely destroy our spiritual heritage as feudal disputes over property, money, and authority. Isn't that the truth? You get a group of Alcoholics Anonymous that has too much money in their prudent reserve, what do you think starts happening? Everybody thinks they know what needs to happen with that money. Right? This person wants to paint the walls. Margareta wants new chairs. I want an upgraded coffee machine, always. Right? Thomas wants to have a sober dance. I mean, it's going to be something. And then what happens? We all have these ideas and opinions. It starts friction. And we start dividing up into little groups. It's not necessary. So what they're warning us against is having monies above our prudent reserve. What's a prudent reserve? Well, you're looking at maybe rent. If you rent a space. So let's say that I know that when I served on the steering committee, we had in our prudent reserve enough money for like 3 months' rent. Should the donations decline, then we had enough money to pay our rent so that we stayed in good standing with that church. We had enough money to buy literature. So that when we took meetings into the facilities, there was a huge closet of just stacks and stacks of those little books that we could take out to the meetings at the treatment centers, hand them out. They could flip through them while we were doing the meeting. We took them back, right? So we had them every week with us. Chips. You know those chips have to be purchased, the ones that you're picking up every month and every year. Those have to be purchased from somewhere. Right? So we've got some money in our funds so that we can support ourselves and support one another. But when we continue above that, my experience has been that we've donated it at a district level, I guess you could say. There's lots of affiliations, like with the intergroup office. There's a program in Dallas. I assume they have it in a lot of places. It's called Night Watch. Y'all ever heard of that? It's essentially a hotline, an AA kind of hotline, where people can call in and ask for literature. They can ask for meeting times. They can ask for information. And so we donated money to that organization so that they could continue to benefit AA as a whole. That was a decision made by our group conscience and by our steering committee very wisely, so that we didn't get into fights over what we were going to do with all that stuff. You mix money and spirituality, it gets real interesting real quick. But I'm not to be affiliated with anything. It says AA group can bind itself to no one. We can cooperate with anyone, absolutely anybody, but I can't bind myself to anyone. So looking at tradition 8, one more thing I want to say about that is the question always comes up with people willing things to Alcoholics Anonymous. Right? So in my will, I leave certain money that I want to donate to a group, or I want to donate. And what it's saying is that anything that carries any obligation financially is unwise. Right? So there's a lot of opinions on what's okay and what's not okay. What we've found is that we can donate those kind of funds to detoxes, to halfway houses, to things like that. But to donate something to a group, what they're going to say is that it's unwise. All right, tradition 8. It says Alcoholics Anonymous should remain forever non-professional. We define professionalism as the occupation of counseling alcoholics for fee or hire. But we may employ alcoholics where they are going to perform those services for which we might otherwise have to engage non-alcoholics. So this is where we separate the spiritual from the material. It says such special services may be well recompensed, but our usual AA 12-step work is never to be paid for. Right? So I don't get paid to be in a service position. Right? I don't get paid to do 12-step work. If I want to work in a treatment center, or work in a jail, or work in a detox, I can become an AA, or not an AA, I can become an alcoholic or drug addict counselor if I want to, but that's not my 12-step work. Right? And it gets very confusing when people in the fellowship, because for whatever reason, we all want to be AA counselors. When we get sober, it's super interesting to me. I did it, so I get it. It's fine for us to do that, but on top of working from 8 to 5 at that facility, I'm going to then need to go out and sponsor people. I'm going to then need to go and take meetings into other facilities and not be paid for it. But when I get confused about what those things are, I get really sick. And you watch that happen to a lot of people. And I've seen a ton of people do it very successfully. We have quite a few friends that do it very successfully. They run treatment centers. They do a lot of really good work. And when they go home at night, they take phone calls from people they sponsor. On the weekends, they go and take meetings out into these facilities and do step work with people. And that's absolutely fine to do. I just have to understand that there's a vast separation in what I'm doing. All right, tradition 9. Each AA group needs the least possible organization. But we have all these committees and all these boards and all that. Right? That was always confusing to me. The least possible organization. Rotating leadership is best. The small group may elect its secretary, the large group its rotating committee, and the groups of a large metropolitan area their central or intergroup committee, which often employs a full-time secretary. The trustees of the General Service Board are, in effect, our AA General Service Committee. They are the custodians of our AA tradition and the receivers of voluntary AA contributions by which we maintain our AA General Service Office at New York. They are authorized by the groups to handle all our overall public relations, and they guarantee the integrity of our principal newspaper, the AA Grapevine. All such representatives are to be guided in the spirit of service. Again, it doesn't matter if you're an alcoholic or a non-alcoholic, at what point you're serving, we're to be guided in the spirit of service, which means it's about you and not about me anymore. For true leaders in AA are but trusted and experienced servants of the whole. They derive no real authority from their titles. They do not govern. Universal respect is the key to their usefulness. Right? So the voice of the group is what becomes paramount. When I'm in a position of service, and we talked about this at some length earlier, that inverted triangle, the service structure, so that when I take those positions, it doesn't matter if it's, I'm an intergroup rep, or I'm going to be a GSR, or I'm going to go all the way up to an area level, and I'm going to start going to all the conferences. That cannot take place of what I'm doing on the firing line from 12-step work. Those are two separate things. But it also cannot be my ideas and opinions that I'm coming with. I'm to meet with the group, take the group conscience, take the steering committee, and all those ideas out, and be the spokesperson. That's a good way to put it. A spokesperson. That's all you are at that point. It's a huge step down, which is a blessing. And there's also, they talk in here about a spirit of rotation. Sometimes that we see in the group that it's a couple of people that are always on the committees. And what they're advising us is that it's best for everybody to take a turn. There's going to be some members in your group that have been there for a long time. And they've got a lot of experience and a lot of sobriety. And those are a lot of the people that we go to lean into their experience. Because they've got it. They've seen what works, what divides a group, what keeps a group healthy. It's absolutely fine, and it's necessary to lean into the experience of some of these people. But as far as the committees, we will have to teach the new people how to do this too. It can't just be the old-timers. We're going to have to rotate all of them through at some point or another. All right, tradition 10. No AA group or member should ever, in such a way to implicate AA, express any opinion on outside controversial issues, particularly those of politics, alcohol reform, or sectarian religion. The Alcoholics Anonymous groups oppose no one. Concerning such matters, they can express no views whatsoever. So if we're confused about what's an outside issue, let's be clear about it. Anything that's not in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is an outside issue, right? Smoking is become like a big hot topic for whatever reason. I agree with smoking. I don't agree with smoking. I don't care. It is an outside issue and it doesn't belong in our meetings, right? So anything that's outside, we learned a lot of that, from the experience of the Washingtonians, who thought they were doing so good with the sobriety business that they would take a stance on slavery. And all of a sudden we're going to get involved in an issue that has nothing to do with AA. Could you personally get involved in that? Absolutely. I have a lot of causes that I support, but I don't put the circle and triangle stamp on them. Make sense? I don't have an opinion for AA with this stuff. And so you don't hear much about the Washingtonians, do you? No, because they disappeared off the map when they put their nose in everybody else's business and thought they could handle all kinds of things that we weren't designed to handle. Right? So if we'll stick to what AA is really about, and the message contained in the text will be just fine. But when we start frogging off into other areas and thinking that we can solve everybody's problem is when we get in trouble. So do yourself a favor when somebody asks you, what's AA's view on religion? What's AA's view on medication? It doesn't have one. I know we all think we know. Do yourself a favor and don't get in that controversy and just say AA doesn't have an opinion on it, right? All right, tradition 11. Our relations with the general public should be characterized by personal anonymity. So tradition 11 and 12 are going to both address anonymity. 11 is going to be from a practical standpoint, and 12 is going to be from a spiritual standpoint. So as we think AA ought to avoid sensational advertising, our names and pictures as AA members ought not be broadcast, filmed, or publicly printed. Our public relations should be guided by the principle of attraction rather than promotion. There is never a need to praise ourselves. We feel it better to let our friends recommend us. So there's an important note, and I believe it's kind of better said in the short form when it talks about our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity, and here's the word, at the level of press, radio, and film, right? And it's often misunderstood, and I know I didn't understand it initially either. I thought I was to remain anonymous to everyone. I mean, my family already knew, so I couldn't really be anonymous with them. But I thought I had to be anonymous with everyone. And what Dr. Bob says in some of his later writings, he clears it up. He says at the level of press, radio, and film. Not above it, not below it. Right? So oftentimes we hear people say, and this is a hot topic of controversy, I'm sure, I only introduce myself as Audrey C., an alcoholic. Well, no. That's a violation of the tradition. I'm not to remain anonymous among my fellowship. I'm to remain anonymous at the level of press, radio, and film. What happens when you try to look up Audrey C. in the phone book when you need help? No. You'll never find me. Do they even have phone books anymore? I think it's all on Google now. You Google people. Anyway, right? But I'm not to remain anonymous with you. And there's been a lot of controversy as to, well, can my name be publicly printed? Can I promote AA? Can I go on TV and say I'm a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous? I got to tell you, the book is clear. I won't argue the point with you. You're welcome to have your own opinion about it. I will read you what Dr. Bob wrote about it. It's an article. It says, it was Dr. Bob Smith who on his deathbed counseled Bill, let's you and me get buried just like everyone else. Dr. Bob also counseled others about anonymity. He is quoted in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers as saying this, since our tradition on anonymity, why is that so hard to say, designates the exact level where the line should be held, it must be obvious to everyone who can read and understand the English language that to maintain to maintain anonymity at any other level is definitely a violation of this tradition. The AA who hides his identity from his fellow AA by using only his given name violates the tradition just as much as the AA who permits his name to appear in the press in connection with matters pertaining to AA. The former is maintaining the anonymity below the level of press, radio, and film, and the latter is maintaining his anonymity above the level of press, radio, and film, whereas the tradition states that we should remain our anonymity at the level of press, radio, and film. I love Dr. Bob. Yes. He doesn't fluff it up. He just directly says it and then leads you to feel any way you'd like to feel about it. I love him. Tradition 12 says, and finally, we of Alcoholics Anonymous believe that the principle of anonymity has an immense spiritual significance. It reminds us that we are to place principles before personalities, that we are actually to practice a genuine humility. This to the end that our great blessings may never spoil us, that we shall live forever in thankful contemplation of Him who presides over us all. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, that, they talk about genuine humility, and, something that was taught to me early on is that humility is really understanding and knowing where the power comes from. I didn't get me sober. Sponsoring Margareta, I didn't get her sober. There's a power at work contained in those 12 steps that I cannot take credit for. I can take credit for drinking enough bourbon to get me here, but that's about where that ends. Everything else has been left up to the power of God if I'm doing the work. It talks about attraction rather than promotion. I definitely tell a lot of people in my life, more people that would really not like to know, that I'm in AA. And I do that for a number of reasons. Number one, I want the life I live to serve a purpose. I want the practicing of principles and the peace I feel in my spirit to attract people to AA. But I'm not promoting AA. And I know a lot of us would like to do those things. I sure would like to change the public view of AA. I'd like to change the media's view. Have you watched movies lately where there's an AA meeting? Yeah. Every time that I feel the need to say to people I'm with, that's not really what an AA meeting looks like, I promise. Because there's the craziest things in there. Right? But I'm to attract people with my life and with the power that God's given me. But I'm to give glory to Him, not to take credit for it. Well, I've been sober 10 years. I've been sober 10 years. How does that sound? That sounds like I'm keeping me sober. Right? I've been sober 10 years. So is my grandpa, but we're not giving him little chips and throwing birthday parties. He's been sober like a million years because he doesn't drink. Right? But I can't take credit for this stuff. And there's something that happens to us as we progress in years in sobriety, and I begin to think that I'm doing this by all the work that I'm doing. I'm doing this. And what I have to understand is I was never doing this. I was never. That if I don't adhere to these traditions and I don't adhere to these steps, I will walk away and die drunk just like any one of us. There's nothing special or unique about me. But I better understand what's in this book and know that practicing principles has to come before all else. It has to. Otherwise, this fellowship will not survive. You've seen a bunch of groups and they go off the map. Why? Because I want to put personalities before principles. It doesn't work that way. You'll find very quickly in recovery, if you stick around long enough, everything's opposite than the way that we've lived before. It doesn't make sense to take action without understanding. But that's what we do in AA. It doesn't make sense to do something when you don't feel a certain way about it. But that's what we do in AA. It doesn't make sense to put the good of the group ahead of my own personal needs, because that's what we're all taught. But that's what we do in AA. So if you want to know why, get into the book and look at this stuff and study it and pull it apart and have lots of conversations about it. This is a living, breathing program. And, Joe and Charlie talk about the big book coming alive. And I thought, well, I'm going to read it one time and then that'll be it. That'll be the whole program. My sponsor will tell you that I didn't want to read the last chapter of the book because I didn't want the book to be over. Because I didn't understand that it would never be over. Ever. How many times? Peter's been sober like 152 years. Something crazy like that. How many times do you think he flips to the book and goes, I didn't remember that little part. I didn't realize the sentence was structured that way. I had forgotten this little portion over here. It happens all the time. All the time, because it continues to come alive. Right? So I would encourage you to make this your own. Take the steps and run with them. Take the traditions and teach them. This is your sobriety, your group, and our fellowship. Cool. Do you have anything to add?
Thank you. I have absolutely nothing to add.
I ended on time.
No? Yes, you did.
You said it couldn't be done.
Thank you.
I didn't know that.